Exchange. After a series of corporate crises, the Johannesburg Stock Exchange is looking at tightening up some of its listing regulations.
Well, high-profile business people and auditors were involved in claims around KPMG and Steinhoff. But what's the role of the stock exchange? Francis, you spoke to the CEO, Nicky Newton-King, a little earlier today.
What some people would say Ramaphoria is slightly cooling, and there's no doubt that economic data is being felt real time by all business people, by ordinary South Africans, and that is definitely pulling down the level of confidence about how fast we can get to inclusive economic growth, which is what we need if we want to pull this country into the possibility that we know is there.
Do you feel it at all as the JSE? In general, the big stocks don't even seem to be linked to the real economy in South Africa. Some of them proxies like Naspers for China. So almost a decoupling. Does that worry you, or don't you mind that?
Well, actually, as the JSE, our job is to offer a marketplace so that South Africans can diversify their investments. And so you actually do want a good balance of stocks that reflect the local economy and stocks that reflect other economies in which they're active. So in fact, it's a very good thing for us that South Africans can invest in the Nasperses of this world, the BHP Billitons of this world, but also very, very local stocks. But it is a concern. I mean, you can see that activity was reasonably good in the first half of the year, certainly up on the first half of last year, which after all was a very dire time in our country's history. But you can see activity is slowing, and I think this is a reflection of the fact that as South Africans we really are looking for a clear future direction, but we are in a time in our country's history where we are debating really important issues like land, like transformation. We're also in the run-up to elections. We should expect more noise, and that makes investment for the long term a tricky decision.
This is interesting. So activity is almost a sign of confidence, and you're saying it is a bit slow. I mean, some economists are saying we could even see a recession when the data comes out from the second quarter. Do you think that that's linked to the activity on the JSE?
Well, definitely confidence is linked to activity. I wouldn't. It's not our role to comment on whether or not we would reach a technical recession, but certainly the rate of growth is too slow for us to be able to tackle sufficiently the inclusivity that we need to build in this country, and we do need to do that if we're going to get to on top of the socioeconomic challenges that we all know we face. But I do want to make the point that the debates about land, the debates about transformation, these are critical, not yet resolved issues in the political economic environment of our country, and we do need to lean in and get those discussions completed, because once we are clear about that, investment will flow. But while these debates are happening, all of us feel slightly at sea about things that we need to consider for our long-term investments.
So uncertainty is still there.
Uncertainty is still there in a way I think was probably under-anticipated at the beginning of the year.
What about the crises? So we've seen high-profile individuals involved, the auditors, the European Central Bank was invested in Steinhoff before it came crashing down. Where does the JSE fit into all of that?
Yeah, so the JSE is the frontline regulator of the markets we operate. We set the listings requirements for our listed companies, and we monitor that they comply with those. And those requirements are really about disclosure, so that investors can make up their minds when they see something, whether or not they want to continue to invest in the company. So we are a frontline regulator of issuers, and we're the frontline regulator of activity on our market. And we co-regulate the entire ecosystem with FSCA, our regulator. And so when, for instance, there is an issue of concern with regard to activity in the trading environment, we will do an initial review, and we will pass that initial review on to our regulator, FSCA, who does the formal regulatory investigation under the legislation. And you would have seen at the end of last week, they actually published the list of investigations that they have, very extensive list of investigations ongoing into market manipulation, potential insider trading, potential improper disclosures and the like.
Do you feel like the JSE missed anything? Say we talk about Steinhoff.
It's not obvious to us that we missed something. But certainly we do think that the nature of the noise that you've been referring to suggests that there are refinements to our listings requirements, to disclosure rules that we should be talking to the public about, and we're about to issue a white paper in this regard, which will actually then suggest that there are areas for improvement, and it'll be very interesting to see how the public responds to that.
So you maybe, like auditors, like analysts, like all investors, maybe need to be a little more skeptical. Can you give me a practical example of something that would change?
Well, we're sort of saying, are there additional requirements on disclosure, for instance, in relation to when people trade shares? Are there additional disclosures that boards of directors should expect? Are there certain more interim disclosures that we should expect to have? So there's quite a lot of quite detailed stuff that we are putting out there as potential places for disclosure. But I think that what is unlikely to be the case is that we will have a wholesale fundamental review of our regulatory environment, because everything that we have been able to see is that this is how our peers internationally regulate markets. You set listings requirements and you require disclosure, and you let investors make up their mind about that.
So you believe you're on a global par, you're benchmarking against the best in the world?
Certainly that's what we've seen, and really the differences are at the margin. But actually we should all take this opportunity to say, this ecosystem that requires trust of investors, what do we all have to do differently? Certainly there must be a question you have to ask about regulators. Do we have to be more do we have to have different requirements, the likes of which we've talked about? What about boards? What about analysts? What about large shareholders? What about auditors? This ecosystem builds a trust on which an investor relies. Shouldn't we all be looking at ourselves in the mirror and saying, what else?
There was a high-profile case. Sagarmatha was going to list earlier this year, and there you actually said, no, we will not list the company. Claims from them that it was nitpicking, that you were giving into public pressure. What actually happened there?
They didn't meet, we initially thought they did meet our listings requirements. We subsequently became aware of the fact that, notwithstanding their suggestion that they didn't in fact meet the listings requirements. We couldn't list them. So, to be on the board in the first place, you must meet the listings requirements. You make commitments to us in that regard, with regard to your meeting of those requirements. If we become aware of the fact that you don't, then we won't continue with the listing.
So it wasn't that the JSE wasn't vigilant enough. Is there a learning experience from Sagarmatha?
There are certain things that certain people have suggested to us that we should have done. For instance, take a view about their commercial viability. We will never do that. Exchanges never do that. Exchanges always take a view that says it's an investor's decision about whether or not they should list in a company. Our job is to make sure that they should get the information out there in clear terms so that investors can understand that. But, whether or not we should require boards to certify more clearly that they meet X and Y obligation as opposed to all of their legal obligations, that's certainly something that we are going to look at.
All right, the CEO of the JSE, Nicky Newton-King, and let's see how the